now we're getting to the heart of the matter and talking to the doctors and getting some really good information about these conditions in clinical trials. And I'm happy, I'm going to tell you who they all are, and then I have individual questions for each one. And as I said before, we'll open it up to participant questions as we go through this session. So first, Daniel Chung is with Spark Therapeutics. As you learned today, or you may have known previously, Spark has developed the first FDA gene therapy for the eye or an inherited retinal condition. That's Luxturna. Dan has done many of these talks, and he's been a part of the outcome measure development for Luxturna in the clinical trial to verify with the FDA that the treatment does in fact work. So we look forward to talking more to Dan. Jill Dolgin is the head of patient advocacy at AGTC. Jill has been active in our space for several years, doing talks like this, talking to our patients and families about their conditions and the clinical trials that AGTC has underway. She's very passionate and very connected to the patient community. And then I'm very honored to have Dr. Gohar Salam join us, who is a practicing ophthalmologist who sees patients. Dr. Salam, I believe you were in Fort Wayne, Indiana, or somewhere in that area. And originally he was going to appear at our in-person seminar in that region, but obviously we're not there, we're online. So we're really happy that he could join us and discuss his eye care expertise. So to start off, let's go back down the list. I'd like each of our panelists to spend anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes to just talking about who you are, your background and role, and anything else you think might be interesting. I have additional questions specifically about research, but let's just start off with a little background. So Dr. Chung, you want to get us started?
Sure, good morning, and thanks for having me on. So I work for Spark Therapeutics. I am their therapeutic ophthalmology leader. Before coming to Spark, though, I trained as a pediatric ophthalmologist with additional training in inherited retinal disease and did a fellowship at the NIH in retinal gene therapy. Was at UPenn for a while, and then that's where I got involved with the whole RP65 program. I was a part of the CHOP clinical development, so very heavily involved with that. And then I came to Spark, which was initiated by folks at CHOP. At Spark, I deal with medical affairs and clinical development, and pretty much act as the inherited retinal disease resource for the company. So it's been definitely a privilege to see this being promoted around the country and with our partners at Novartis around the world. So I've been in the space for about almost 25 years now, so it's definitely a place that I have enjoyed. It's always a pleasure to working with FFB, and just look forward to the rest of the session today.
Thanks, Dan. Next, Dr. Dolgin.
Thanks, Ben.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm a clinical pharmacist by training, a PharmD. I started my career about, don't even want to say how many years ago, as a clinician in a large pediatric hospital, serving as the clinical pharmacist, but also as the head of a poison and drug information center. So I have spent my life as a pharmacist educating patients and families, one patient, one family at a time, one phone call at a time, until I joined a pharmaceutical company about 20 years ago, and began to engage with third parties, nonprofit organizations such as FFB, and working with them, able to educate patients and families by working through larger organizations. So in general, in the biotech and pharmaceutical industry, patient advocacy tends to be focused on serving as the voice of the patient and a representative of the company, both inside the company and externally. So what does that really mean? Essentially, I am the voice of the patient inside AGTC by ensuring that every conversation we have about our clinical trials and development, about our assets that we're choosing to move to the clinical trials, that we are ensuring that we are meeting the needs of patients. I'm certainly not an expert on inherited retinal disorders. I came to AGTC 4 years ago. Most of my career has been spent in cardiovascular diseases and oncology. So I rely on my interactions with the patient community and groups like FFB to better understand what are the challenges that our patients that were interested in the therapeutic areas that we're interested in, what are they going through? What's most important to them? What are the barriers that they have in carrying out their activities of daily life? And certainly as enrolling in clinical trials, what are those barriers that we may face as we try to move these forward? So there's in the area of gene therapy, what's been inspiring for me is that there's so much information that needs to be articulated and disseminated to the patients. So my role is really to make sure that patients are empowered and families are empowered with the information they need so that they can take an active role in their care. So externally, my job is working with groups like FFB and explaining gene therapy, as Ben has so nicely done today, the importance of understanding their genetic cause of their disease, as well as educating them about common questions. What does it take to enroll in a clinical trial? What are the challenges they may have? And helping them understand the importance of their participation in a clinical trial, what they're signing up for, and how those questions, what the communities need to know about new treatments and so forth. So happy to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Glad you're here, Jill. Thank you. And then it would be great to get an introduction from Dr. Salam, who is sporting a New York Yankees sweater.
For
very
all
attractive, even though I'm not a Yankees fan.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be in the company of such esteemed presenters. I am a retina surgeon here in Fort Wayne, Indiana. By training, initially I trained as a family physician, family medicine doctor. I taught family medicine at Michigan State University for a couple of years. But my heart was always with ophthalmology and retina, so went through quite a few years of more training, and then finally established a practice here in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where I see patients, I teach other residents, and started my own fellowship program. I have trained other retina surgeons, so it has been a wonderful journey. Just a little background, which I look back and see my journey. It's almost 30 years now that I have been a doctor, and almost 20 years with ophthalmology now. When I was in family medicine and wanted to move into ophthalmology, at that point in time, strangely, ophthalmologists, unfortunately, were number one among the physicians to commit suicide. It was such a dark and such a depressing field where patients would come up and then seeking for help and advice. And unfortunately, a lot of times doctors would say, particularly when we are dealing with progressive diseases, that there's not much to help. So all of that hardship, the doctor would just take in within himself or herself and develop this darkness, and unfortunately that would lead them to commit suicide. So my friends, when I was moving into ophthalmology and retina, they would actually sometimes get concerned or even laugh I'm switching to ophthalmology. Do I not like my life? And I would tell them at that time that the reason why I wanted to move to Retina was because I was seeing at that time, and this is 25 years ago, 27 years ago, what was happening in the field of retina and ophthalmology. And I knew even at that time things were not good, but in very near future, within next 10, 20 years, there will be treatments available. And so I moved into Retina and have been extremely pleased with my decision, because I would be talking a little bit about this disease with macular degeneration, which was the leading cause of blindness in hundreds of thousands of people, and how we completely changed the course of that disease is absolutely remarkable. And we are doing the same with many, many other diseases. So I've been happy with what we have been able to do. I'm very happy with what we would be able to do. There's a lot of things in the pipeline, some in the early stages, some getting closing towards the closure. So very excited. I got involved with Foundation Fighting Blindness almost 15 years ago in the very early stages when I was starting practice, and have been very impressed with the commitment that the organization has. You know, when we deal with very common diseases like macular degeneration or diabetic retinopathy, and there's a significant financial interest for the companies to develop treatments, that actually are the diseases that get conquered earlier. But when we are dealing with more rarer diseases like Stargardt's or even retinitis pigmentosa, unfortunately for the drug companies and the research companies to really make money out of that procedure and developing a drug, which is a very exhaustive procedure, is not very much. So financially, it's not very lucrative for the companies to invest. So that's where the organizations like Foundation Fighting Blindness play a very critical and pivotal role. And I'm very proud of what FFB has done. So kudos to all you guys, and I'm very proud to be part of the organization. So today we'll talk about some macular degeneration, and I will be happy to answer any questions. So again, thank you very much for inviting me to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Salam. Thanks for being part of our team. Great to have you on it. So I'm going to go back to Dan. And I know Spark is always getting a lot of visibility for Luxturna, but Spark also has a clinical trial underway for a choroideremia gene therapy. So if you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe if you want, before you talk about the trial, maybe let people know what choroideremia is, what the choroid is. We don't often talk about it when we're doing retinal education.
So choroideremia is obviously an inherited retinal disease caused by the CHM gene, and it's a defect in something called Rab escort protein, which helps traffic or move different components within the cell. And when that bogs down, you have basically cellular function dysfunction and then cell death. So this is one of the, what we may call rod cone dystrophy, in the sense that it starts in the periphery, as you had mentioned about rod photoreceptors, and then slowly migrates to the middle where the cone photoreceptors are. So people will experience peripheral field loss, they'll experience night blindness or decreased vision and dim light. One of the things about choroideremia is that it is relatively slow progressing. And so that is one of the challenges that we have for clinical development of any kind of therapeutic. The reality is that relatively early on, you may still have relatively good visual fields, and visual acuity a lot of times doesn't get affected into your 40s and 50s. Matter of fact, in natural history study that we're doing right now, we have several patients in their 60s that are still about 20/40 or better. But their visual fields are significantly reduced. We're talking literally, we've heard of that whole concept of looking through straws. And that's exactly what these patients have, is their visual field is so small, but yet their visual function within that very central area is still quite good, which definitely has some challenges when it comes to clinical development. And when I say that, is basically using some type of therapeutic, but then it being able to measure any benefit from that. And it's a little tougher in these slower moving diseases. So the choroid is actually a way that the back part of the retina gets its vascular supply, or its nutrition. And what you see when you look at a retina like this is that you see basically the whole outer area of the retina, and it depends on, of course, where the patient is in their progression of disease, but you basically see that the retina is very atrophic, and you see the posterior circulation of that choroid. But this is a disease where the retina and the choroid degenerate, and you lose visual function that way. So we do have a phase 1/2 trial currently. We have been fully enrolled in that trial, and we are currently following patients in that to look, again, phase 1/2s are really about safety, and obviously we'll look at efficacy, and that trial is ongoing in our follow-up. And as you mentioned before, there are other trials as well by the Biogen Nightstar group that is also now has closed their enrollment in their phase 3 trial as well. So there are a number of things that are going on with choroideremia.
That's great, Dan. I have a follow-up question. So I know with Xlinked RP, X-linked diseases, without getting into the whole way things are passed down, but generally speaking, men have the diseases and women are carriers. But over time, we've learned that women can be affected too, even if they're just a carrier. They can have some vision loss, and on occasion it can be pretty significant. Do you guys, or do doctors come across women who have choroideremia? Because choroideremia is an X-linked condition. It's mostly affecting men.
Yes, so that definitely does happen. I think that in what you'll see, obviously, in a lot of reports is that even though you look at the retina itself, it may look like there's a significant degeneration sometimes in who we call the female carriers. But what we have found is that the visual function really hasn't been altered too much. Now, as disease progresses in some of these female carriers, though, they will start getting visual deficits. However, gene therapies most likely will not target those carriers initially, because that would be a different protocol, a different paradigm of how to treat them. So most of these choroideremia trials really target the male patients that are affected directly and not the female carriers.
Right, but it does underscore the need to get genetic testing, because I would suspect a lot of doctors who have female patients aren't thinking choroideremia.
Absolutely. A lot of times when you do genetic testing, a lot of times there'll be a ask for familial testing to confirm things as well. So getting things from mom and dad. And in X-linked disease, that becomes definitely a key thing, to have more familial testing and to test the mom in those X-linked diseases. Absolutely. And genetic testing, as we have said many times, is really the definitive way of understanding the diagnosis of patients with inherited retinal diseases, or for that matter, any genetic disease.
Right. Great, thank you. Thanks for that nice overview. So Jill, I mentioned, I gave a bit of an update on the Achromatopsia and Xlinked RP trials. Do you want to provide whatever additional detail you can? I know the regulators limit what you can say, but if there's any more detail, that would be great.
Well, what I can tell you is that in February, we announced that we had completed the enrollment of the, in our XLRP trial, we had completed enrollment of the 2 highest dose groups in Xlinked RP. And we are continuing to collect information on those individuals. And basically the information from those 2 additional dose groups will help to reinforce the data that we generated to date and reported back in September as well as in January. So over the next several months, we plan to report some interim data from these 2 new dose groups and to report some top line 12-month data for the first 4 dose groups that were already treated in the next few months. And we also intend to talk to the FDA and hopefully if the data continues to show encouraging data, that we intend to initiate a pivotal trial, meaning a phase 3 trial, by the end of this year. In our Achromatopsia trials, we also reported some ongoing progress, and we expect to have multiple data readouts towards the end of this year as well.
That's great. And just a follow along question, something that we get very often is what should people expect if they commit to a clinical trial? I'm going to put a little spin on it because I know sometimes some of these trials are enrolling younger patients or even a minor. And so what are special considerations for those younger patients?
Sure. Thank you. Absolutely. Those are considerations both for the younger patients as well as individuals who, of course, have families to take care of, who have jobs, who may be in school. And again, that's part of the role of patient advocacy, is to ensure that we are incorporating that voice of the patient, their concerns, into our clinical trial design. In other words, we expect, it's a very time-consuming process. Many of these trials are designed the same way, in that there's over 12 visits just in the first year of the trial, and then follow-up visits over the next several years. So the first 12 months are critical in terms of the screening, in terms of the follow-up following the retinal surgery. We need to make sure that we have taken into account all the challenges they may face. So to your point, we try to make sure that we are ensuring that we have travel arrangements for those individuals, that we're making accommodations in terms of hotel, lodging, food, et cetera, as we plan the trial. So that's part of using the role of advocacy to ensure that we're taking those considerations into as we plan the trial.
Right. That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Salam, when you were introducing yourself earlier, I was thinking back to when I started with the foundation in 2004. It was right at the time when Macagen was FDA approved, the first anti-VEGF for wet AMD. And that I was very new to this space. I knew very little about anything in our space, but that was a really big deal. And it's amazing how far we've come since those Macagen days. But if you can let us know about some of the exciting things happening in the AMD space, that would be great. By the way, Macagen is a wet AMD, I don't even know if it's still around, the first anti-VEGF wet AMD treatment.
Yes, Macagen actually was a really big game changer for this devastating disease. So just to give a little synopsis of what macular degeneration is, macula is the focus part of the retina. Retina, as you were describing earlier, is actually the wallpaper that lines the inside of the eye and serves as a screen. So when the image gets focused on that wallpaper, these brain cells convert that image into picture signal and send that signal back to the brain through that cable that connects the eyeball with the brain. That is the optic nerve that you had mentioned. So macula happens to be the center part of the retina and helps us with our central or focus vision. It has a lot more of cones and a very densely populated area with cones. So anytime when somebody is trying to focus on something or see something up close or pay attention, we move our eyes so that the macula is the area that gets the attention and the image is focused on that. It is said that almost 70 to 80% of our vision comes from the macula. The rest of the area helps us, of course, with our side vision, peripheral orientation vision. But the macula is really the area that we help to see further definition and things in distinct detail. So with macular degeneration, unfortunately, it's a chronic degenerative condition, which typically happens in elderly people. And what happens is that the body starts developing tiny fat waste products in the focus area of the eye. which typically a person, as we are aging, we are developing some waste products and we are supposed to get rid of them as we age. But in these patients who have macular degeneration, these fat deposits are not able to be gotten rid of, so they start accumulating as small whitish yellowish darts in the focus area. We call them drusen, D-R-U-S-E-N. And a lot of those patients who have macular degeneration and these drusen, they are actually asymptomatic. They would not actually have any trouble at all. But there are times where the body does not like these fat deposits and it tries to get rid of them. And that's where the cells would start getting sicker, tired, the image starts getting affected. When that is happening, unfortunately, the body thinks that it can take an extremely dire step and start making new blood vessels in the back of the eye underneath the macula, thinking that those blood vessels would help replace some of these damaged areas, maybe provide more oxygen, more nutrition to that area, not realizing that these new blood vessels, whenever they develop, they are unfortunately extremely abnormal and fragile. So they start leaking water and blood underneath the macula. Because both water and blood are wet, that's why we say the macular degeneration has turned into the wet kind. So in some estimates, unfortunately, in the United States, where I practice, there are almost 10 million patients who are affected by macular degeneration. Luckily, 80 to 85% of them are of the dry macular degeneration kind. It's about 15% of the times where the body will end up making new blood vessels. Vast majority of the dry macular degeneration patients are good. They are asymptomatic, but almost 10% to 15% of those dry macular degeneration end up having a lot of damage done to these processing cells, and they also end up losing vision significantly. There's unfortunately not a good treatment for that at this time. But with wet macular degeneration, when the body is making new blood vessels, and it's a very devastating, very rapid decline in vision, the researchers almost 40, 50 years ago were trying to find this one signal that was making the macular degeneration turn from dry into the wet kind. And when we had not identified this particular chemical that you had mentioned, which is VEGF, it stands for vascular endothelial derived growth factor. Just like how anything to grow, it needs nutrition, like a plant needs to grow, it needs to have water. So this chemical, which is VEGF, serves as the nutrition for these new blood vessels to develop. So when the researchers did not know what this was, we actually used to call it factor X. We would say that, yes, there is a factor X that has developed, and that is what would make these blood vessels grow. And finally, for our benefit, that factor X got identified as VEGF. There are other factors, growth factors as well, like angiopoietin and some of the other chemicals which play a significant role in this vessel development. But the VEGF is the main compound that we are targeting at this time. And you mentioned Macagen was the first anti-VEGF compound that was developed to block this chemical so the blood vessels would stop growing. Macagen was a very early drug. It did help some. The results were better than how things were before. But then as time went by, there are better and better anti-VEGF agents that became available. And there's just one that actually even got FDA approved late last year. And there's a lot of excitement about that. So we have come a long ways for the management of the wet macular degeneration. Now we just need to identify these patients early. Anytime when a patient is beginning to notice some change in vision. And that's why it's extremely critical that patients monitor their vision one eye at a time, because not uncommonly we see that the other eye, which is being not so affected, takes over, and a person does not even know that they are losing vision in this one eye. So it's very critical to close one eye at a time and just monitor, see if they're beginning to notice some dark areas in the vision or any distortion. And if that is happening, they need to go to their eye doctors right away. And if the problem is happening because of macular degeneration, that's where they get sent over to us as retina specialists. And the earlier we catch it, the success of a lot of these medications to help stabilize things is extremely high, almost higher than 90% in stabilizing the disease at a good level. But these are chronic treatments where patients come and we give these injections as an injection into the eye. It goes through the white part of the eye. We numb up the eye. It's not as bad as it sounds. And every so often, every 4 weeks to 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, depending on how active the body is in making these blood vessels, we have to repeat those injections. And so that is what has happened for the wet macular degeneration. There are other compounds that we have identified that could work against the vascular endothelial derived growth factor, as well as other chemicals. As I was mentioning, angiopoietin is one of those that we are trying to develop compounds against. So there's a lot of new drugs which are in the pipeline, and we are hoping over the next 3 to 5 years, our ability to proceed to tackle this disease would be actually at a much higher level. One significant development with the current medications that is happening is that right now, as I mentioned, that these patients need to have repeated injections. There's actually a significant advance in having a port delivery system, meaning that there's a reservoir that we implant on the outside of the eye, which has a link to the inside, and we refill that reservoir every 6 months. And so these patients actually, hopefully within a few years, may not need to have these repeated injections at all. We would just they would have to show up at a doctor's office every 6 months, and we refill that reservoir, and that medication gets deposited internally. A very exciting development, which I believe is going to take perhaps 7 to 10 years to come to fruition, would be that you mentioned a lot about gene therapy. There's actually significant progress where the researchers have identified and developed a mechanism of delivering a gene inside the eye so that the body can be making these anti-VEGFs by itself. So rather than depending on these external medications, the body would be producing its own anti-VEGF, and that would obviate the need for any other intervention at all. So once that happens, that would essentially what I would consider perhaps a very significant step towards a cure, a permanent cure for this. So a lot of exciting things for the wet macular degeneration. Dry macular degeneration is where the good part is that vast majority of those patients are asymptomatic, but when they are becoming symptomatic, those 10 to 15% of the patients, that's where unfortunately there's still significant struggle and no good treatment is available. We do start patients who have dry macular degeneration on a combination of antioxidants because this aging injury happens because of accumulation of these oxidation byproducts. So the goal had been to see if we can block some of these oxidation byproducts by these antioxidants where vitamin E, vitamin C, there are copper, zinc, zeaxanthin, lutein. So we have made a combination of this into these vitamins, which were studied with age-related eye disease study. The second part of that recommended that patients who have moderate dry macular degeneration, they should start using that, and that should help slow down the progression of that macular degeneration. When the macular degeneration is, and also significantly, I must mention that there are other life changes that one should make to help with the dry macular degeneration. And the most significant thing would be to stay away from smoking. Smoking has been shown in every single study, both first and second-hand smoke, to cause devastating damage for the patients with dry macular degeneration or any macular degeneration. So they should stay away from smoking, healthy diet, healthy exercise. I know if perhaps maybe I was looking in the chat, there was a question about Mediterranean diet, and if we have some time, I would love to answer that as well to see what would be involved. So antioxidants are recommended for the dry macular degeneration. When the disease is advanced, where the cells have unfortunately been died out because of atrophy and now there are no photoreceptor cells of no retinal pigment epithelial cells that support the overlying retina. Once they die out, that's where patients really develop a very large dark area in the center part of the eye. Few years ago, FDA had approved a telescope to implant in the eye to see if that would help. It's very tricky for a lot of people to use that telescope because you need to go through some visual rehabilitation, which is rather significant and consuming. So it's not been as popular as the initial hopes were. We have tried translocating the healthy retina on top of the sick area, and there had been some good success with that in the past. Some of the researchers, I think in the chat, there was also, you had mentioned about the retinal transplant. And as you rightly mentioned, it's extremely complex to talk about when people talk about the transplant regarding the eye, typically it's the cornea that is being transplanted. To transplant the retina would involve that now we are actually having all these retina cells and brain cells getting connected in the same way to the back of the eye. So that's a very, very consuming process. But one of the things which, to our surprise, actually, we had seen as clinicians is that in patients where they had developed a loss of the retina in the central part of the eye in a condition called macular hole, we had actually been able to do what is called autologous retinal transplant, meaning that we have been able to look at the healthiest portion of one of the healthy part of the peripheral retina, and then just like how we do skin transplants, we remove that from that part of the retina from the side part of the vision and then move it to the center part of the vision. And in some of the studies where it is being done, it has shown some very promising visual recovery and anatomic recovery. So there's a lot of hope for that as well. For the new directions for the dry macular degeneration who have lost all cells in the center and have been living with this large dark spot. Just like how we identified the factor X for the wet macular degeneration to be primarily VEGF, luckily we have identified these damaging pathways for the dry macular degeneration as well. And vast majority of this is researches around this complement activation pathway. Anytime when there's a threat or there's damage or there's killing involved in the body, that gets mediated through complement pathways where the body goes through a cascade of chemical events and releases some end chemicals, which makes your cell just end up killing the other cell. So for the dry macular degeneration, there has been a lot of excitement about these new chemicals that we are looking to see if we can alter this complement pathway and cut down the process. There was one drug that we were very excited about that was being researched for many years. Unfortunately, early last year, the year before, some of the final results were not as promising. So now that trial was closed, but there are still many other trials that are going for the dry macular degeneration as well. So hopefully within the next 3 to 5 years, we would see some good progress on that.
Great, thanks for that comprehensive overview of what's happening with AMD. Chris, let's open it up to participant questions.
Sure. So it looks like there's a variety of questions been around clinical trials, and you had explained, to go to clinicaltrial.gov to find out more information. Some folks were asking, are gene mutations, specific gene mutations, do they have their own clinical trials, or are they grouped with others?
So I can start. It really depends on the type of trial. I think that Ben had mentioned something like RDCVF, which is a neurotrophic factor. And something like that really is not gene specific, but it is a general intervention for mainly rod cone dystrophies where they're trying to preserve the cone cells. However, Many of the trials that Ben talked about are what we call for these monogenic diseases, in the sense that it is very specific to that gene and the variants or mutations that are in that gene. So for instance, the RP65 gene therapy is specific for patients that have RPE65 variants. It really doesn't matter what the clinical diagnosis is, because even in doing our natural history, we found that these patients had 20 different clinical diagnostic labels. What matters is that they have genetic testing and that they have variants or mutations in the RP65 gene. And that goes for achromatopsias that they're doing with CNGB3 or CNGA3, with the different RPs that are on there for RLBP1 and a couple of the others. Stargard's, obviously, that's the ABCA4 gene. So those, yes, those are very much gene specific.
Great, thank you. And in regard to that, some of the questions that have been coming in with COVID-19 out there, is genetic testing still occurring? And then at the same time, are clinical trials still occurring?
Happy to start. I believe that most of the genetic testing folks are still ongoing, although there may be a lag in responses. And then, sorry, I forgot the second part of that question already. Maybe somebody else can.
Clinical trials.
So clinical trials, yes, this has all really been a definite challenge during the COVID-19. FDA has come out with some guidelines concerning the practice of clinical trials, and especially of inpatient or patient visits to these clinical centers. And what you find too is that the clinical trial centers are usually large academic centers, and they have already imposed strict limits on who can come to the center, and especially for clinical trials. I think that that is probably the most important thing, is that's the safety of the patient that is paramount. And a lot of times these clinical trial participants are on different types of immunosuppression and things of that nature. So for the most part, most with guidelines from the FDA and from the individual clinical trial sites, I would think that a lot of the clinical trials are on hold when it comes to actual patient visits to those clinical trial centers.
Perfect. Ben, earlier you were talking about different vitamins and antioxidants, and several folks have been asking about vitamin A tied to Stargardt or even vitamin E. Can you talk about some of the updates about supplements? What are some of the guidelines if people have questions about what specific antioxidants or vitamins to be taking, with the various diseases? What's the best that they should do?
Sure, I'll address that. So the vitamin A therapy that most people hear about was the work of Elliot Burson and his colleagues at Mass Eye and Ear, and that ultimately turned into vitamin A, DHA, lutein, and zeaxanthin. And we actually have a vitamin A guide on the website, and if people download that, they have information about that protocol. It's generally speaking was evaluated in people with RP and Usher syndrome. People with Stargardt disease should not supplement with vitamin A. I repeat, people with Stargardt disease or cone rod dystrophy should not supplement with vitamin A. That's an entirely different thing. And it could be detrimental to their vision as opposed to helpful. Now, Elliot Burson's work has always been a little controversial. Not all doctors will prescribe it for their patients. Some will, some won't. It's really important that the patient talk to their doctor and also get their liver enzymes checked annually, because the recommended dosage of vitamin A is relatively high. And it's vitamin A palmitate. It's not just any vitamin A. It's not beta carotene. So download the vitamin A guide, talk to your doctor. Those are the two important things. People with Stargardt disease, cone rod dystrophy, don't take vitamin A. but I can defer to Dr. Salam about AMD and the AREDS2 formula, which he sort of mentioned already.
Yes. So, as you have rightly pointed out, Ben, vitamin A had been studied in this one trial. That's where the most initial trial, they were combining vitamin A, vitamin E, and no treatment at all. And at that point in time, they had, this is the first big trial that I'm talking about. They had realized that patients who had retinitis pigmentosa should not be taking vitamin E at all, because that was making things worse. And with vitamin A, unfortunately, how the study was designed, the results were kind of inconclusive in some ways and somewhat favoring in some ways, depending on how your interpretation was. So since then, there was a soft recommendation that vitamin A should be given to, or vitamin A can be taken to slow down the disease. Unfortunately, the real evidence for vitamin A now, when we look back at some of the other information that we have, is not really that encouraging. So also, as you're pointing out, vitamin A, the dosage is rather high, and vitamin A can have a significant impact on liver. And so in a setup where we are not so sure about the benefit of that vitamin A and potentially taking the risks of vitamin A, a lot of retina specialists are shying away from the recommendation of having vitamin A for retinitis pigmentosa patients, particularly in women and childbearing ages. Vitamin A has significant teratogenic effects, so that also is another concern that can cause an issue. For macular degeneration, the beta carotene that was used, which is again a form but not exactly the same vitamin A palmitate as you're pointing out. The first AREDS trial used the beta carotene as an antioxidant, and we did see that it did have, as a combination with other antioxidants, did have benefit. But one of the things that we had realized was that patients who were taking the beta carotene and had a history of smoking first or second hand, they unfortunately started having a higher signal, a higher rate of having lung cancer. So even though there was a benefit of beta carotene, with the second formulation for the AREDS vitamins, which is now called AREDS2 vitamins, they actually omitted, they removed the beta carotene, and instead they replaced it with a couple of other antioxidants, namely zeaxanthin and lutein. So beta carotene is an antioxidant, and just like how we are trying to minimize any of the aging injury, antioxidants would be good, but there should be caution in taking beta carotene.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to take one that looks like someone is online. Farouk, you should be able to ask your question. You can unmute by hitting Alt-A.
Hello?
We can hear you, Farouk.
Yeah, hi. So I want to ask the Dr. Salam, I am a patient, I have retina pigmentosa, unfortunately, but when I do some genetic test, they told me I have not retina pigmentosa, CHM. So I need to know where the latest research about my gene, because when I, as they mentioned, when I go to I have a create account, my ophthalmology and my retina tech track. So it's phase 3. So the treatment is available or still waiting. So that's, they say, complete phase 3. And I was use supplement vitamin A, but now my ophthalmology, they changed it for lutein and zeaxanthin. So I keep use those vitamins.
Farouk, I had a little hard time hearing that question. So I believe that your one question is about vitamin A.
I was use vitamin A, but the doctor, they say in new research, they change it for vitamin Latin and I'm sorry, like Latin and let me check the name.
So
Dolgin.
yes.
Yeah. So I keep use those because I was use vitamin A, but they say the new research, they say vitamin A is not good. They write it those vitamin.
So essentially, with what the doctors are trying to do is to help you supplement your diet with some of these antioxidants. But as I had mentioned earlier, vitamin A is not really that much in big favor with all the research that we have. So I would agree with your ophthalmologist that perhaps maybe vitamin A, there's no point in taking that. There's no real benefit that, at least with the current data that we have, looking at the electroretinogram studies and also the visual field studies, we have not been able to document that it really helps in a significant way. Now, supplementing with other vitamins also have not been so well studied. So at this point in time, my typical recommendation would be to, of course, have a healthy diet, have some exercise, have a good lifestyle, stay away from first and second hand smoking, and perhaps maybe that is how you're supporting your system very, very well. I know that there was this one possible question about the Mediterranean diet with macular degeneration. And the Mediterranean diet, I just wanted to bring it up in just a minute or so. Also, the reason why some of these people who are living in Mediterranean areas are found to be healthier than other parts of the world is because Mediterranean diet is also found to be high in antioxidants. They eat a lot of these vegetables and some nuts and fish and white meat. They stay away from the red meat and processed foods. They absolutely stay away from. So, and they have found that even there was one study where macular degeneration, the progression was slowed down by using Mediterranean diet. So I don't want to really recommend any particular diet at this time. I would, because again, the knowledge sometimes keeps changing. And as we know more, we realize, oh, we thought maybe we knew enough, but the reality was not. So right now, I would just say for somebody like you, maintaining a healthy lifestyle, healthy diet, exercise, I think that should be all that would be needed. And I believe that for your research trial, I think we, perhaps maybe Ben can help us to see where you're located and what kind of gene you would have, because we do have a complete registry of these trials that are going on, and they can perhaps guide you, Ben can guide you about the trial for yourself.
Yes, happy to do that. And I think we're going to hold off on more questions, but we will get back to people. It'll take us a little while, but we will get back to people who had questions that we just didn't have time to answer today. I just want to thank our panelists for doing a wonderful job explaining the research, clinical trials, and answering the questions. And to close things out, I'd like to pass it back to Linda Schellest to talk about our virtual vision walk.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thank you all for participating in today's webinar. Before you leave, we want to just announce the launch of our National Virtual Vision Walk Day, which is happening on Saturday, June 6th. You can find out more information about this in details by calling your foundation office, your local foundation office, or visiting visionwalk.org. Our Vision Walk may look different this year, but our mission to fight sight-saving research is unchanging. Our next webinar will be held next Saturday, April 25th from 10 a.m. to 12 noon Eastern Time. The speakers will include Ben Shaberman, Senior Director of Science Outreach and Community Engagement with the Foundation, Dr. Thomas Ailman, an ophthalmology specialist with the Shy Eye Institute, Carrie Branham, who's a clinical assistant professor, genetic counselor of Inherited Retinal Dystrophy Clinic, and she's at the University of Michigan Kellogg Eye Center, and Dr. Frederick Osmus, Vice President of Clinical Development at ProQR. So on behalf of the Foundation Fighting Blindness, thank you to our speakers, Ben Shaberman, Dr. Daniel Chung, Dr. Jill Dolgin, and Dr. Gohar Salam. Just a reminder, if you have any questions that were not addressed in today's session, please email them to chapters@fightingblindness.org. We'll also be releasing a recording of this webinar in mid-May. Finally, thank you to everyone of our attendees for joining us today. The Foundation is a beacon of hope, and because of your support, we are able to shine even brighter. Please stay safe, and we hope to see you on our next webinar on April 25th. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.